In this talk, I shall introduce you to our 9-part chart. Now, there are many, many ways of explaining alcohol problems. But through the years, we have developed one method that we have found very useful, and useful not only for patients, but for staff, for families, and others that are associated with them. It at least serves to provide a common platform, a common basis of discussing these problems and understanding them in some kind of practical manner. Here's the chart, or the outline of the chart. Really, it's made up of 3 panels. First panel we call the predisposing factors. The second panel, adaptation to heavy drinking. And the third panel, the secondary damage. Now, in addition to examining each one of these panels vertically, we try to indicate a physical sequence of events, the physical predisposing factors, the physical changes as the person adapts physically to heavy drinking, and finally, the secondary physical damage. The mental situations that help initiate contact with alcohol, the mental changes from adaptation to heavy drinking, and finally the mental secondary damage. And the same, of course, for the social. Now, in the last talk, we indicated a relationship between stress, disease, disability. Now, I'd like to show you on this board something to do with stress and what is responsible. What is responsible for changing a particular experience from a non-stressful to a stressful experience, from the green to the yellow? The intensity of exposure, the frequency of exposure, and the duration. These factors apply regardless of the part of the world we're talking about. Our experiences in the biological world, the material world, or the human world. But zeroing in more specifically on our chemical experiences, then we could begin to consider these as how much, how often, how long. And these, of course, are the factors that combine to determine the dose. The factors that combine to determine whether the contact with a particular chemical is a non-stressful or a stressful experience. Now, with the particular branch of the chemical family that we call chemical comforts, there are about 3 main situations responsible for introducing us to these chemicals and for establishing the dose. The first would be medical prescription. Some of these chemicals that we call drugs are also capable of producing effects that we very much enjoy. But under those circumstances, a physician who knows how to prescribe these drugs properly would take the responsibility as to how much would be used, how often, and for how long. He would be aware of the fact that he might be actually prescribing a stress dose, but he wouldn't maintain it long enough for breakdown. He wouldn't maintain it long enough for the drug itself to begin to cause its own problems. Now, similarly, forgetting for a minute the chemical comforts, think about the precautions that may occur in industry for people working in the midst of particular chemical hazards in their work situation. And under those circumstances, the safety engineer, the industrial physician, the industrial hygienist may make certain that the total dose, the intensity of exposure, say to lead, the frequency and duration is not enough to be a stressful, potentially disabling experience. Now, some of the other situations responsible for introducing us to chemical comforts: occupation. Physicians, nurses, druggists, dentists, veterinaries, by virtue of their work, are regularly in contact with a whole range of chemical comforts. And unless such people are particularly careful, the familiarity might breed contempt. They might get careless about it and become over and involved with the chemicals they work with. But the one that I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about is alcohol, that we don't encounter because we work with it. We don't encounter it because a doctor prescribes it, but we encounter it because there are social customs involving its use. So in those situations, there isn't a physician advising us how much, how often, how long. There are no safety engineers, and if we aren't careful, we can blindly go ahead and have our total dose determined by a whole range of factors that we don't very well understand. Under our predisposing factors, we shall examine the physical situations that help to determine the dose, the mental situations that help determine the dose of alcohol, and the social situations involved in the dose. Together, they're going to combine to determine the fact that a particular intake of alcohol is in a dangerous, a harmful, or a stress range, or in a safe one, whether it's in the yellow or whether it's in the green. Now, also in these predisposing situations, we'll talk about the initial dependence. The initial dependence upon alcohol is due to the fact that in harmful quantities, alcohol is capable of producing a whole range of welcome effects, desirable effects in a great many people. If by some chance the welcome effects were limited to a safe dose range, we would have nothing to worry about. But that isn't the case. Some of the most enjoyable effects in certain people are only achieved with a very high dose range, a very dangerous one. So that the initial response, the initial desire, the initial dependence at this stage is a reaction depending largely upon the degree of enjoyment, the degree of need, the degree of desire. So this is largely what will be covered here. Now, regardless of what set of circumstances initiated a particular drinking pattern, initiated a particular dose range, a person has no choice but to adapt to this intake as well as he or she can. The process of physical adaptation to a harmful intake of alcohol that we often refer to just as heavy drinking, this process of physical adaptation is more successful in some people than others. And sometimes we feel that the most unfortunate person from the standpoint of uncontrolled dependence upon alcohol is the one who can adapt to heavy drinking too well, too successfully. Because I think this is a good time to bring out the fact that a harmful intake of alcohol may not be obvious to the drinker and may not be obvious to his family, to his employer, to his friends, or anybody else. The quiet, progressive, somewhat insidious physical changes of adaptation may be hidden for a very long time until eventually there's a breakdown. Eventually there is a warning that this, for a long time, has been a stress, a harmful, a dangerous intake of this old anesthetic, ethyl alcohol. During this period, of course, we will see an increase in tolerance with a need to step up the dose still further. We'll eventually talk about withdrawal reactions as part of this experience. Mental adaptation takes the form of habit. Now, initially, back in the early reactive phase, a person may have been using alcohol in harmful quantities to relieve anxiety, to relieve pressure, to relieve boredom, to relieve loneliness. a reaction to undesirable personal or social situations. But as he continues to use this method, as this technique in living begins to be usual, normal, or a part of him, drinking just for the sake of drinking begins to be added to the original drinking to relieve anxiety, frustration, or whatever. So that mental adaptation takes the form of habit. Social adaptation, with all of the existing social drinking customs, excessive as they are, about all that's required, of course, to get in trouble with alcohol in many situations is just to drink and roam as the Romans are doing. However, sooner or later, the person who has moved from a controlled dependence on alcohol in harmful quantities through to this uncontrolled dependence, sooner or later he will have to manipulate his world to accommodate his need. He'll have to manipulate his family, and he'll have to manipulate his friends in order to maintain his supply. Now, what's the byproduct of all of this? Because by now the person has a double set of reasons for drinking heavily. His original reasons for dependence and the additional reasons from the process of adaptation. So that more and more he is involved in secondary consequences. Secondary damage from intoxication, acute and chronic, which we'll go into in later lectures. Secondary damage from malnutrition. Secondary damage to the membranes of the upper gastrointestinal tract, from the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, and the stomach. There is a whole range of secondary damage, usually responsible for a great many admissions of patients to all kinds of hospitals, general hospitals, mental hospitals, special hospitals. Secondary mental damage. The reaction of the person whose brain is repeatedly anesthetized by this oldest of all anesthetics, ethyl alcohol. What changes would you expect if you repeatedly put your brain under partial anesthesia with ether? These are the kind of changes that you can expect if you put your brain under repeated anesthesia with the still older anesthetic alcohol. What is the reaction to progressive social damage? A whole range of mental changes for this reason alone. And finally, the most important part of the chart of all, from the standpoint of the public. Because the secondary social consequences from uncontrolled dependence upon alcohol, uncontrolled over an involvement with alcohol, the secondary social damage is greater than with any other of the chemical comforts that I have mentioned in other talks. For example, there's such a range of difference between the secondary social damage of an uncontrolled dependence upon nicotine and an uncontrolled dependence upon alcohol. Secondary social damage in the home, on the job, and in the community. The kind of changes that involve the courts, judges, police, and so on. So, as we proceed with the rest of the description of what takes place in the different panels of this 9-part chart, we will hope to express or explain this in such a way that you'll come to appreciate which of these changes can be reversed completely, which of them are totally curable, which of these changes are partially reversible, and which are there for keeps. Because like anyone else who acquires changes that cannot be cured, the victim of uncontrolled drinking has no choice but to learn how to live with whatever can't be changed.